Battlefield comes up, we could definitely reading the opening.
The opening, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Page or something like that. Could be like
and I wouldn't mind if it does come up, I could read Plowboy. You could read any of your favorite.
okay. I think we should.
Yeah,
Just yeah.
because some students may not, some readers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to 192 Books. I'm Terrence. I'm the manager. We're here to celebrate the publication of this book right here, The Life and Poetry of Frank Stanford by James McWilliams. It'll be in conversation with Patricio Ferrari. The Life and Poetry of Frank Stanford offers for the first time a comprehensive study of Stanford's life and work, introducing to a broad readership poetry that remains both captivating to poets and in its celebration of everyday experience over academic erudition, accessible to those who rarely read poetry, and those who do as well, I'd say. Stanford's poems range from one line to his 15,283-line epic, The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You, which is now out of print, and James is working on a reissue coming on February of next year. Also with the University of Arkansas Press. So I will skip a bio of Stanford and let you guys get into that, but James McWilliams is a writer and historian who lives in Austin, Texas, and when he can, New Orleans. He has taught at Texas State University since 1999, has published articles in Oxford American, Virginia Quarterly Review, Paris Review, The American Scholar, Harper's, and the New York Times Book Review. He's a recipient of the Hyatt Prize in the Humanities. He's now writing a book on the New Orleans poet Everett Maddox. Patricio Ferrari is a polyglot Argentine-Italian poet, literary translator, and editor whose transcontinental journey began as a Rotary Exchange student at 16. He holds an MA in Comparative Literature from the Sorbonne, an MFA from Brown University, and a PhD in Linguistics from the University of Lisbon. The author, editor, and translator of 20 books, published across 6 countries, and with 4 more coming up in the U.S. He received the 2025 Fence Modern Poets Series Prize for Mud Songs, the first volume of Elsewhere, a multilingual trilogy exploring how languages shape identity through what he terms pederophony.
Yeah, that's enough. That's
Okay.
Yeah.
And they'll speak for maybe 45 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A, and the books are for sale here. But I'll pass on to Patricio. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terrence. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Those of you present and live streaming from all over the world. Thank you, James, for coming to New York from Austin. Thank you, students, readers, neighbors, and 192 Books for opening your home again for another event. I am thrilled to, as a Frank Stanford lover, to have finally this book out and more forthcoming. And of course, reading this page turner over the last week, I have been thinking about so many poets that I love and what those poets who one loves make you feel when you first encounter them, right? And it kept coming back to me that so many of the great poets did die young, and whom the gods love died young. We find this aphorism by the Greek comedian Menander, and this aphorism we find in Leopardi, we find in Byron, we find, of course, in Pessoa when referring to his beloved friend who committed suicide at the age of 25 in Paris, Sacarneiro. And of course, we can think of poets who Frank Stanford himself loved and died young. Keats and Byron come to mind. If poets throughout the history of literature have turned to this aphorism, is perhaps because there is some truth to it, at least to the truth that youth, and with youth comes myth. And there is a lot of myth around Frank Stanford. We're going to be talking about that myth making, what Frank himself created, but also the people around him in Fayetteville, and of course, after his suicide. But at the same time, thinking about all of this and the myth making and poets before Frank and Frank himself, reading the book, and which is so informed, the scholarly work the effort, the passion that went into this project that James put over 7 years is really moving for me as poet, but also as a scholar. We've all read many biographies, and I think that this one can show what a genre of nonfiction in biography, in writing a biography, can be. To really, as a lover of Frank Stanford, to find a reference to everything that James says, literally to everything, to every single claim, either by going to the archive at Yale or an archive that is not even public yet, or talking to people who, many of them are no longer, but during the process were alive and James was able to interview, is extraordinary, and is really something to celebrate. The work and the love again and the passion bring forth in the myth making of Frank, shows someone, a human being at work, driven, funny, reckless, yet disciplined from a very young age. And that really we feel throughout the pages. So for someone who left behind a body of work that still unsettles and moves us almost 50 years after his death, it's so celebratory to have finally this biography out and more to come. So thank you, James, for being here with us. And I turn the mic to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel like we should just end right now.
No.
Actually, I feel so good after that introduction. It's been such a successful evening. Thank you so much. But I really want to thank Terrence and 192 Books for hosting this event, and Patricio for putting it together and actually reading my book so carefully. Like, it's an enormous compliment. So I want to begin by just saying a little bit about Frank Stanford's death, and then I'm going to read a passage from my introduction which gets into his life. Those of you who know about Frank Stanford most likely know him through his death, or at least quite aware of his death. He shot himself 3 times in the chest with a .22 revolver on June 3rd, 1978 in Fayetteville, Arkansas, after having an argument with his wife and his lover, who had recently discovered each other. And it's a dramatic death. And my way to handle it is, and it's contributed to a lot of the Stanford mythologization. So the way I decided to deal with this posed a bit of a narrative problem. I just decided to get it out of the way in the beginning, and to write a preface where I not only get it out of the way, but de-romanticize it as much as I possibly can. And the way to do that was to track down every possible detail about the suicide itself, the weeks leading up to the suicide, and then just sort of put a period at the end of it and say, okay, now we're going to move on. And my hope was, as I wrote the book, that readers would read it almost forgetting how it would end, that it would engage readers enough to kind of pull them into the story as if they were going through it in real time. So for you to say that it's a page turner is very much a compliment, and really makes me pleased with the strategy that I chose to get the suicide out of the way. I've actually started some readings just by reading that preface, and it's really not the best way mood-wise to begin an evening focused on the joys of literature. So what I'm going to do is read the introduction. Not the whole introduction. I'm just going to read the first couple of pages just to give you a sense of Frank's life. This is going to cover some biographical information, but also just the tone of the writing as well. So again, after you finish the horrible story in the preface, I open up this way. Everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. The words of poet Jack Gilbert, who Frank never knew but should have, reminds us that a death does not define a life. At least it shouldn't, especially a life as actively lived as Frank Stanford's. Stanford shot himself 3 times in or near his heart at the age of 29. Like so much about his life, the final act seems almost impossible. His was a dramatic exit, and those who know Stanford cannot avoid speculating about why it happened. But those are motives only one man will ever know. For all his obsession with death, this book is not an attempt to analyze or even understand Frank Stanford's suicide. As one of Frank's friends put it, of his death we should have little to say. With this I agree. Stanford's nearly 30 years were full of life. He was an orphan who never met his biological parents, a summertime resident of Mississippi levee camps staffed by black laborers, the educational product of Benedictine monks and an autodidactic reading habit, a teenager who lived a comfortable bourgeois life in a lakefront house, a prodigious and promiscuous lover, a student of cultures local and global and high and low, a child prodigy, a land surveyor, a muse with a near photographic memory, a devotee of jazz, blues, film, and classical music, a barfly, a karate and judo expert, a publisher, the founder of a small press, an exacting gardener, a savvy editor, and when it was time to tell the big lie, he was astonishing. So yeah, Icarus flew. Stanford was a chameleon. As a kid, he fashioned himself into a Southern aristocrat with Mississippi heritage and roots dating back to England, to Earl of Sandwich peerage, no less. Later, he became a periodically reclusive and often brooding artist from northwest Arkansas, a charismatic and well-read Ozarkian hillbilly who wrote poetry that proved irresistible to the nation's leading journals. Toward the end, he buttoned down, cut back on his drinking, and acted as a professional editor of his own small publishing company, Lost Roads Publishers, where he ushered young and under-recognized talent toward future success in a spirit of wisdom and guidance. Finally, ending the journey with what his friend the poet Thomas Lux called an irreversible cliché, he became a writer whose reputation has been overly defined by a striking, self-inflicted, and fatal act. But there was and always will be the poetry. From a very young age, it was a constant in Frank's life. Accolades from contemporaries never wavered. Allen Ginsberg praised Stanford's writing and urged him to send more poems to him. Alan Dugan labeled Stanford a genius, a true poet. Thomas Lux admired his correspondent's rare talent, deeming his poems goddamn terrific. Franz Wright called Stanford poems staggering for their courage and beauty. Eileen Miles said that his poetry was lurid and mythical. John Berryman, Terence Hayes, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti have all praised Stanford's work. Richard Howard, whose own poetry could not have been more unlike Stanford's, taught Stanford's poem in his Columbia University classes. C.D. Wright noted that everybody who met him stirred to his vision. Ellen Gilchrist summed up the poetry world's feelings for Stanford when she said that everybody worshipped him, adding that he was a genius, a true, complete, and total genius. Such affirmation might go to anyone's head, and Stanford was hardly immune to the allure of praise. His personal struggles were one thing, and they were reliably mercurial and intense. But his faith in his own poetry, even before he began to publish it, remained steadfast. In the early 1970s, he typed out the claim that, "My feet will fit William Faulkner's boots like a glove," noting how he planned to whip every poet under 30. In the same type note, seemingly written to himself, he flexed even more, saying, "I am going to be Jean Cocteau and William Faulkner at the same time." In 1970, he bragged to a fellow young poet that Pablo Neruda spit me into the ear of Jules Renard. A few years later, Stanford wrote to his publisher that poets of all persuasions so far have liked my work. That means I'm writing poetry. His feelings were unequivocal. I like being accepted by all phases of the literary scene. Egotistical, yes, but not necessarily wrong. Stanford was writing bold and original poetry, and few readers knew about it. He was writing poetry that led Jim Whitehead, his teacher at the University of Arkansas, to call him the most brilliant poet of his generation. It was poetry that led poet and Frank's friend John McKiernan to tell Frank Stanford scholar A.P. Walton that he is the best poet of his generation, period. Poets so disparate in style, background, and artistic temperament as those listed above universally shared high admiration for Frank Stanford. This kind of admiration affirms his broad and undervalued influence on the modern American literary tradition. Stanford has had important fans, but he still lacks a wider readership.
So, tell us a little bit now about how you knew one day that, of course, at first as a reader, and then that you wanted to embark on a many-year journey. You certainly didn't know that it was going to be seven years of reading, rereading, interviewing over hundreds of people, going to multiple archives across the country, both here at Yale and Washington State, where his once current editor of loyal to Frank, publisher of 7 books, I believe, is still around and conserves a great part of his archive, and follow so many other trails. When did you know, and at what point did you say to yourself, "What did I get myself into?"
Yeah. So, like, when you just mentioned everything that I had to do to write the book, if I would have known, like, I honestly don't know that I would have, because when I proposed this book to my editor, I said, "Oh, he only lived 29 years. His archives are at Yale. Give me 3 years and maybe 250 pages." And here we are, 600 pages and almost 10 years later, the book. So I don't know, like that. What I had to do to write the book did not become clear to me until I had already made the decision to write the book. And there were points where I thought, "Oh, this is going to be too much. Like, I'm not going to have the resources to do it." Thankfully, I didn't listen to that too much, and I kept going with it. But in terms of like why I decided to write this book, the most honest answer I can give to you is I fell in love with Frank Stanford's poetry, and I felt like he didn't have the exposure that he deserves. And so in some ways, this book just comes from a little bit of an angry sense, and I'll be honest with you, a little bit of an angry sense that the underdogs don't get their due. And I think, Frank's own poetry was very much concerned with the marginalized and those who didn't get their due. And I kind of felt like more people needed to know about Frank Stanford. I think during his lifetime, the fact that he was such a kind of, deeply committed to the American South, and not just the American South, but after a while, sort of the hills of Northwest Arkansas, kept him from getting attention in places like New York. Now, I should say that he subverted opportunities to get that attention, and we can maybe go into that later. But the motivation to write this book was to kind of put my shoulder behind Stanford and his reputation and try very hard to push him at least towards some sort of canonization, at least some sort of anthologized presence with his work, which he doesn't get. The other reason is that when I find people who have discovered Stanford, including you, there's something just different about the discovery of Stanford than the discovery of other forms of art. It seems to hit people in a particularly emotional and visceral way, and I just get a charge out of that. I have discovered writers that made me feel like, well, I've won the lottery, and it's a kind of, I've just won this lottery, and I want others to have that experience as well. So that's all part of it. I could go into sort of like when I first started to read Stanford and all that, but that's not terribly exciting. I'll tell one quick story, though, and that I was in line reading The Mind Reader, which is a long poem of Stanford's. It's the first time I encountered the poem. I think it was 2016, and I was in line to rent a car in Boston, and I fell into this poem. It's a super long poem, and when it was my turn to go, I'm like, no, go. And so, like, when that happens, you have to sort of sit down and ask yourself, I got to pay attention to that.
But the first time was with The Battlefield, right? So The Battlefield, Where the Moon Says I Love You, was Frank's, of course, greatest work, the book that almost he worked on for nearly half his life, almost at least 10 years, if not more. But when we strip away the legends surrounding its composition, what do we actually know about how the poem came together? But perhaps most importantly, what's so extraordinary about it? that didn't exist then. It hasn't existed anything like it since, and that makes it so important to this day.
Yeah, so the battlefield, I mean, it's over 15,000 lines long. It's unpunctuated. You know, the first sentence is the last sentence. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. But, you know, it's unique in a number of ways. One, Stanford delves deeply into the various registers of Southern vernacular. And as you read the battlefield, you're going to hear it's set in 1960. The protagonist is a 12-year-old boy based on Frank himself. And you're going to hear upper-class registers coming out of the ballroom at the Peabody Hotel in Memphis. His family was well-connected. They were wealthy. They went to the country club. Stanford knew that language. He was comfortable with that language. But as a kid, Stanford, because his father was a levee engineer, also went to levee camps in middle of nowhere Snow Lake, Arkansas. And, you know, he's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. He and his sister were the only white kids there. All of his friends were black, essentially unsupervised. It was kind of, he had these feral summers. His mother was working the commissary there and overseeing the books of the operation. The father was overseeing the levees. Stanford and his sister and these kids just kind of ran wild. And you get that register as well. So Stanford absorbed at a very young age the register of, like, you know, poor black country kids. And that kind of worked its way into his poetics as well. The battlefield's like the only place in all of his poetry where he fully lets that go, where you get the contrast between the, you know, sort of lower, rougher registers of the Mississippi Delta and then the higher registers of the country clubs and the ballrooms.
And even foreign languages.
And foreign languages, Italian, Spanish, French, German. And he knew none of those, by the way, but somehow he got them into the Japanese. He got them into the poem as well. So you get, you get the U.S. South. You get various Souths, but you also get a kind of like omnivorous global appetite that is worked into the poems as well. It's very hard to describe the poem, but I mean, the way I would do it and the way I try to do it is imagine if like Faulkner and the bluesman Robert Johnson and like Jean Cocteau got together to put together a poem. It might look something like that.
Do you want to read a few lines from it?
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah. Please, just to open and perhaps.
Tonight the gars on the trees are swords in the hands of knights. The stars are like 27 dancing Russians, and the wind is. I'm waving goodbye to the casket of my first mammy. Well, that black Cadillac drove right up to your front door, and the chauffeur was death. He knocked on the screen. He said, "Come on, woman, let's take a ride." He didn't even give you time to spit. He didn't even let you take the iron out of your hair. You said his fingernails was made out of water moccasin bones, and his teeth was hollow. He was an egg sucker. You said he reached up under your dress and got the nation's sack. You said the conjure didn't work. He didn't smell the salt in your shoes. You said he came looking for you, and you hid out in the old house, in the outhouse. You waited for him with a butcher knife. You asked him, why not let the good times roll? Wow. I mean, it just gives you a sense of the language. And like reading that, like, kind of don't try it at home right away. One of the joys of this poem is it's unpunctuated. But I actually say I think it is punctuated. The punctuation is just not visible. And so you have to add it. You have to put it in as you read. And it leads you to invest more into the poem than you might otherwise do.
Tell us a little bit about when you quote John Stuart Mill about the utterance overheard, or also what CD called the lower tones,
right?
In his work.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that Frank had he was led by his ear. I mean, he listened to the way people talked. And he actually said at one point that he when he listened to people talk, he waited for almost like a I think of a psychotherapist doing analysis on somebody and waiting for that Freudian slip. And when that Freudian slip happens, they dive in, you know. And that's what Stanford does. He would listen to people talk. He particularly hung out at this, as a college student, he hung out at this the only black-owned business. It was a bar in Fayetteville, Arkansas, called Sherman's Tavern. And I actually tracked down people who were with him there and remembered him there. And I asked him, what was his demeanor like? What was Stanford doing there? And he was waiting for utterances overheard, is what he was doing. Yeah, you said John Stuart Mill. My heart leapt. I'm like, did I include John Stuart Mill in my book? But you're right, I did. I added that towards the end, and I thought I was going to have to give a really academic answer here. But you scared me. I'm just saying, yeah.
Exactly.
So Frank would wait until he heard something that really sounded interesting to him, a way of phrasing something, and then he would make note of that and work it into the battlefield. And there are some great scenes in the battlefield where it's young Francis, who's modeled after Frank Stanford. Young Francis is listening to his chauffeur, Charlie B., who he admires. He thinks Charlie B. is the coolest cat ever. And he listens to the way Charlie B. talks, and he actually says to him, can I talk that way? And Charlie B. is like, you can try. And this gets into some pretty complicated territory because it gets into, can I use the N-word? And Charlie B. he says, I hear you using it all the time. And Charlie B. is like, you can try. And he kind of gets a little excited using it. Charlie B. says, okay, that's enough. Okay, you're done. But there's this kind of experiment going on. Like, how far can I go to use this dialogue? The other thing you can look for as you read the poem is Francis at times will speak in kind of perfect, proper, quote, perfect, proper, educated English, but over time, his language becomes more and more vernacular, more and more like he wants it to be.
And for those who today would say, well, wouldn't that be appropriation? When we read your second chapter, and we understand and see how, which is wonderful, it's one of my favorite chapters, when Frank is 4, 5, 6, 7 going to the levy camps, and he is, for so many months, I mean, if you put together the 5 years, it's over a year and a half hanging out with his kids. He's probably also speaking that way too. So when he returns to that, he's also doing it from the body is just tapping into memory.
Yeah, no,
right?
absolutely. So these early years, the imprint of that language was very deep. There's no question about it. But he stopped going there at the age of 8 or 9. And then when he went to boarding school, I mean, he went as a kind of stereotypical white Mississippi racist kid. He hung a Confederate flag on his dorm room and wore a Confederate cap and talked about the Old South and actually treated the one black kid in his class horribly. And then he kind of converted back, and it was when he met this group in Fayetteville. And so the appropriation question is difficult. It is appropriation on some level. It's undoubtedly appropriation, but you're absolutely right. There was a kind of genuine grounding in this language, in this culture, as a young child. But I would say this, the appropriation, if that's what we want to call it, was driven by genuine and impassioned curiosity. He just liked the sound of that language better and wanted to be around people who spoke that way. And this contrast became most intense when he was an undergraduate taking courses in the MFA program, and he's in these seminars where people are speaking like MFA students, poetry students do in seminars, and he's like, fuck that, And then he'd go to Sherman's and, this is what I want. This is what I want to hear. So it was genuine.
That question that what is wrong with the sound of American poetry, right? Is that comes up, and it's connected to that.
Yeah, and so he introduced these poems, bringing this kind of these idioms and these sort of country vernacular into the seminar, and people loved loved it. They found it to be an honest expression.
And if you want to take tell an anecdote about like how that happened, and he was an undergrad, but then all of a sudden he's sitting with the grad students, and how did that happen? And maybe
Right. So he was an undergrad. He started as a frat boy and a business major, to make his mother happy, because this kind of fit the role that she wanted him to play. He had not sort of come out as being adopted yet, and so he was still kind of ingrained in the old Memphis expectation of living the way he was supposed to live based on the family that he came from. But he quickly broke away from that. He started to take some English classes and philosophy classes, and I think he was deeply, deeply interested in those philosophy classes, and eventually declared himself an English major, and was writing poetry this whole time. I mean, actively writing poetry for days and days at a time without sleeping.
beginning in high school.
Yeah, I mean, well, he probably even began as a preteen writing. Some of his poems are from the age of 9, so he really was a prodigy. And he, it's unclear to me actually how one of his poems landed in the hands of Jim Whitehead, who was the poet who ran and novelist who ran the MFA program. Whitehead saw this and saw a few of these poems and was really blown away by them. And he's like, I want this kid in my seminar. Now, Frank showed up in the seminar, and Whitehead immediately loved him, because Frank Stanford he's about 5'9", really a strong person. Like, he practiced judo, he was an athlete, he was muscular. And Whitehead was big guy, football player from Vanderbilt, muscular. And Whitehead hated the fact that all of his poetry MFA students were these like scrawny, pasty, greasy-haired kids. And he's like, we need some virile masculinity in this room. So he saw Stanford. He's like, you will do, sir, and brought him in. But Stanford's poems really ended up really kind of impressing and winning over the entire seminar. And I should also add, like, this was a day and age when in a poetry seminar, when people delivered their poems, there wasn't the sense that, oh, we mustn't hurt their feelings. We don't want to ruin, their inspiration or damage their self-esteem. Like, people actually aimed to send you home in tears. And some people did go home in tears. And so Frank endured a pretty rigorous gauntlet in that seminar.
Any of the great moments that Frank during that program, that, let's just call it moments that he benefited from, but in a good positive way, great encounters that happened because this poet or that poet or this editor or that editor went to Fayetteville?
Yeah, absolutely. So Frank, he did not I don't know, like, he never was very generous about the other students around him. And I think this was part of the myth-making, Frank, was he wanted to be the lone genius. He wanted to be the kind of prodigy. He wanted to, be the youngest and the smartest. And, like, he even did things like when he edited a journal in 1971, he changed the ages of some of the people publishing that journal so he would be the youngest. And this mattered to him. And so he didn't want to claim any kind of affiliation or collaboration or influence by some of his peers. But when Allen Ginsberg came, he could pull it together and really impress Ginsberg. And when Alan Dugan came, he did. So these poets who came, Frank, he was not obsequious. Like, he wasn't disingenuous in terms of kissing up to them, as it were. But he put on a good act. Like, he acted like the kind of person who you would want to hear more from. And he wasn't that way with his peers, but he was with these, like, kind of impressive poets who came. And his career really did benefit immensely from Alan Dugan's support.
And then at some point, after 2 semesters, so he's no longer an undergrad, but he doesn't want to sit in the MFA workshop anymore, but he does go to this conference, and the IRV happens. And we learned through your book, we would not have Frank Stanford without Irv Broughton, at least the Frank Stanford that we know. So tell us maybe a little bit about that, and maybe about him, because you met him, you went out there twice, and if you want to, whatever you want to share about Irv. He's editor.
Yeah. I love Irv. I'll say that. But so Frank went to this conference. It was a Hollins writers conference, I think, and film conference in 1970. And while he was there, he met Irv Broughton in the parking lot. They chatted, and Irv had a publishing company that consisted of Irv, and it was funded by cash advances on his gas card. But Irv read he read The Singing Knives. He read the 22 poems that became The Singing Knives, and because Frank had his manuscript with him, he was kind of planning to shop it around. And they had breakfast the next morning, and Irv said, "I'm in love with this, and I want to publish it." Now, around the same time, Stanford also was approached by a friend and another editor who was going to show it to Random House and said that she was pretty certain she could get Random House to be interested in The Singing Knives. So you gotta think about this for a second. Here's Frank Stanford. He's got Irv Broughton with, Mill Mountain Press and no budget, and then he's got Random House. And Frank went with Irv Broughton. And I think this is it's not only pivotal that he met Irv, but it's pivotal that he made this choice, because in doing so, he determined that, number one, I am going to maintain complete control over my poems. I don't want anyone editing my poems. And that would remain true for most of his life. There's a couple of exceptions to that. So he's declaring at that moment, I'm going to maintain complete control over my poetry. Also, he was declaring, I don't trust the big commercial venues. I just don't think my art will thrive by going into those commercial venues. And this sounds romantic. It also sounds naive, and I think it's both. But I think what Frank got out of this decision was Irv Broughton publishing 150, 200 of his chapbooks, and those chapbooks sort of infiltrating their way into Fayetteville, and people guarding them and protecting them as if they were the most valuable possessions they had ever had. And they still have that cachet. If you want to go online today and buy Arkansas Benchstone, $4,000, So Frank, it's impossible to overestimate how deeply Frank loved the cult appeal that he had, and how deeply committed he was to remaining in many ways off the commercial grid. He valued that very deeply. Now, of course, that's why a lot of people who even read a lot of poetry haven't read Frank Stanford. There was a cost to that. But that's the choice that he made in that parking lot in Hollins that summer.
Anything about that you want to share that you learned through not just reading and rereading his published work, but through the archives, about his creative process, and then perhaps a little bit about his versions that he did after Bertolucci, after Follin, other Pasolini, other artists, writers, filmmakers.
Okay, so the first thing to say about Frank's creative process is that he was prolific. I mean, manically prolific. And one of the kind of cardinal rules that he had as a poet was if you ever sort of are aware of the fact that you're writing poetry, you're not writing very good poetry. It was very important to him to kind of enter a kind of altered state, not with psychedelic drugs or anything like that. He used sleep deprivation and alcohol, kind of a slow drip of bourbon or beer, to enter a place where he just felt detached enough from reality but connected enough to his senses that he could turn out the poetry that he wanted to turn out. And then he churned it out. And so, The Battlefield was actually one poem of 50 others of a larger manuscript called St. Francis and the Wolf that may at one point have exceeded 40,000 lines. And at one point, when he had a mental break, he burned some of his work. It was 15,000 pages of work. He had that kind of manic prolific approach to writing that he did through sleep deprivation and this alcohol use. But the other thing that was really fueling him was not just his ear for the way that people around him were talking, the kind of search for that Freudian slip, as it were, or utterances overheard. By the mid-'70s, really I'd say 73, 74, he started to think that he wanted to bring global voices into the South to see what would happen. And so he started to read into kind of the French surrealists, the anti-poems of Nicanor Parra, even some Japanese warrior poetry. And what he would do, and you can probably explain this a lot better than I could, so I'm actually going to bounce this question back to you, but I'll tell you in general what he did, and then you can maybe tell us more specifically what he did. But he would take a poem, say, for example, by Jean Follin, and even with a dictionary, he would translate it, like word for word with a dictionary, or have somebody who knew some French to translate it for him, and then he would rewrite it.
And then some passages I've never seen, and I don't have a name to this because it is not necessarily a version, because the poems are so close, yet there are 4 or 5 lines in a 10 line, say 10, 12 line poem, where he's going to, and you quote in the book, you quote Borges and the color local. What Frank does, he changes some an image that Follin will use that is more of a French image of a place, and he will turn it into a Fayetteville like or a soda case or a corner.
You know, in that
store.
At one point, he has the character in the poem who's sitting on I think in Follin it's a maybe sitting on some steps, but in Stanford's version, it's like an old porch. And then at one point, the protagonist of the poem in the Stanford version spits. Nobody spits in the Follin version.
But if you read, say, the opening of the poem or the end of the poem, the words are almost word by word. Yeah. So you would say, okay, this is almost a literal translation. But then it's when you read those 4 or 5 lines, it's a transcreation, but at the same time, it's not. So it's something that I have never seen before. And he's done this in many, many poems, and it just be so interesting to look at because certainly no one was doing this at the time. And Frank, almost out of intuition and need of those world voices, he began doing this.
I think he did it and I think he did it. I think it's worth remembering that he did this because he was always looking for a deviation from what was familiar to him. And so I think by 74, 75, he had kind of worked his way through the kind of black country vernacular, or just the country vernacular, and he was even getting some feedback from people he trusted, like, you know, I think you've done this enough. I think you've done all you need to do with that language. And it's then when he started to look abroad. And but notice that he didn't go abroad. He brought those poets and those filmmakers to Arkansas, and he put them in that environment almost to see what would happen. And I think that was something that really excited him. He didn't know what was going to happen.
Even to this day, it's so interesting to read and see how exciting and creative that such a process could be for any of us writers. Now, since we are in New York, maybe you want to tell us about maybe the most foreign place that Frank ever went to was New York City.
Yeah,
for a month in '72. If you want to.
Yeah, so Frank, I mean, his whole he spent his whole life in the South, with the exception of 5 weeks, and 3.5 of those weeks were here in New York City. He stayed in Staten Island. He took the ferry across every day. He wrote on the ferry. He loved the ferry. But he came when his feet hit the island of Manhattan. He went to movie theaters. He saw 100 movies in 3.5 weeks. He had a real appetite for foreign film, and he had a hard time getting those films where, you know, he lived in Arkansas. Although he tried to open a theater and got Janice to send him a bunch of films, but his appetite exceeded what was possible in Arkansas, and so he saw films. He was usually went into the theater with sneaking in a bottle of wine or two, so he would, you know, drink all day, and he would watch movies all day. And then towards the end, for those 3 weeks, he somehow had 6 girlfriends by the end of it, and one of them worked at the MoMA, and she would let him in at the end, and he'd wander around and look at the art. So it was a culturally sort of immersed experience for him, but he didn't like New York. He said it's a strange place. He never really felt comfortable here. And the woman that he was staying with in Staten Island was a girlfriend. He left without telling, snuck off with the woman from the Met. The woman from the Met rented a Mercedes. They drove to D.C. to meet a friend of hers. She went in to see the friend. Frank bailed from the Mercedes, found a bus to Mississippi.
A letter from this lady, Cheryl, right, then almost saves his life in a way. In a way.
Yeah, so the woman he stayed with, and
A year later.
I did not find Cheryl. Cheryl was in many ways a woman I think Frank loved, to the extent that he like truly loved a woman. I think he loved Cheryl more than any of the women that he was with, and she
At the time.
at the time, yeah. And so I couldn't find her. Until almost a year and a half before I was done with the book, I found her. She had 35 letters from Frank. She had stories to tell. So I had to kind of take her story and weave it through the book because I didn't find her then. Because she had a different name at the time. I was looking for Cheryl Campbell. Turns out her name had a different. And how that happened is a whole story in and of itself. But it involves. Remember that? Remember watching Sesame Street? Remember they had that black modern dancer on there? He would always often come on as a guest. He actually was my connection. He lives in Jamaica. He had owned the house that Cheryl was living in, and it just ended up finding Cheryl's last name that way. I found her, and I found out who she was when I got her last name. I was on the phone with her within 20 minutes after finding her last name, and she said, "I will tell you everything."
Extremely important character
and
in the book.
Tears came down my
in
face.
Frank's life.
And then I thought, I got to call my editor and tell him I'm not going to have the book done on it's going to be even later than I.
Because there is a mental hospital moment for Frank Stanford for a week or even more, 10 days.
I didn't even answer your question.
And
so
then
he
a letter comes and
he tries to kill himself in 1972. Yeah. By swimming until he passed out. He went and got in Lake Dardanelle, which is a lake near Subiaco, and he swam, I think, for over 8.5 hours. But he made it back to shore, and one of the monks came running up and said, "You have a letter, you have a letter," and it was from Cheryl saying, "I'll take you back." And he wrote effusively to her about how she saved his life.
Maybe something about the year 74, 75, very stable, very productive for Frank. He's in the country with
Personally,
his second wife, Ginny, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the time perhaps also of Field Talk and other chapbooks.
Yeah.
If you could say something about those.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe happy, stable.
Yeah, he met
good.
Jenny. He met Jenny, his second wife, Jenny Crouch Stanford, who is today quite a prominent painter, a portrait painter. She painted Hillary Clinton's White House portrait, I believe. But at the time, she was just learning to paint, and they really bonded. Like, Frank had visions that he wanted her to paint, and then he would write poems based on those paintings. It was a really kind of beautiful symbiotic relationship artistically that they developed. They chose not to live in Fayetteville. They moved to almost rural area in Rogers, like on the edge of Rogers, Arkansas. They lived in a modest house with a nice view of Beaver Lake. And Frank was working as a surveyor and writing poems. Jenny was painting all day. They had a garden. Frank quit drinking. He was keeping a really responsible budget. It was like remarkably stable, and Frank couldn't stand it. It only lasted about 2.5 years, and he started to whatever kind of wildness he needed to indulge, he started to dip his toes in by going back to Fayetteville and sometimes into Eureka Springs, just hang out at bars, to hear that language again. And he got sucked back in to a point that that's when he met CD. Yeah.
Well, before we move there, maybe we can read one poem. Can I have you read now? I'd love you to read it.
Which poem?
Plowboy, perhaps.
Why don't you read it? Yeah.
No, please, James. Yeah. This is how Field Talk opens. Plowboy.
So Field Talk, as Patricio pointed out, was most likely written during this time of relative comfort. There's a lot of gardening. Did you notice that in there? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Plowboy. I came up on death and love, hung up like dogs in my garden. I had no broom or cold water, just a plow and a pony. The both of them shined like a mirror of double or nothing. So I told them, stay out of my greens. What I really meant was, what I really meant was, what do you want? I came up on death and love in my garden, lessons in paradise. It's a beautiful poem.
Oof,
Yeah.
thank you. So now coming towards the end, so this so he meets CD right in Fayetteville around maybe 76.
Yeah, and by then in 75.
75.
Actually, it was October.
So right around
it was
when
October of
Field Talk
75
comes out.
right around that time. And Frank's reputation in Fayetteville was huge at this time. He had published all these books. To see Frank in the streets of Fayetteville was worth like telling people about. It was a story you told later. And he went back to a party that Jim Whitehead was having, and he went because I think there was going to be a screening of the film that he made. We didn't talk much about that, but he made a film
In 74.
Came out in 75 that won an award at a film festival in Seattle.
And it's a film available, right?
You can watch it on YouTube.
Watch
It's called "It Wasn't a Dream, It Was a Flood." And so, his stock was high, and he went into Fayetteville. He went to this party, and I think he intended to kind of catch up with people, but he ran into C.D. Wright, and they went into Jim Whitehead's office, and they talked for 4 hours, and then he ended up giving her a copy of the his like onion skin paper, typed copy of the Battlefield. She read it through and was completely in awe and in love with Frank. And then they used the starting of the press in some ways to move in together. That was the cover, because Frank was still married to Ginny. Ginny was feeling his absence more and more. Ginny ended up moving to southern Missouri, where her family, she inherited a home, a pretty grand home from her family. And, those were the years where he just lived that big lie. 2.5 of them, and he went back and forth between Fayetteville and southern Missouri.
And even so, maybe could you say something about how the collaborative role that he would have to nurture the women he was with, the artists, women, C.D., Ginny, and not only others as well.
Yeah, I really do doubt whether Frank Stanford was capable of having, I hate to use the term normal or healthy, but, a kind of loving relationship, a committed, loving relationship. He interacted with Ginny and CD through art. That was really the main way he communicated with them. And so with Ginny, as I mentioned, it was her, he would instruct her. He would, tell her in many ways what to paint. And she loved his poetry. She trusted his aesthetic vision and did it and benefited from it by her own account. CD as well. She really allowed Frank to take her under his wing in terms of poetry. And I think Frank taught her a lot. And one of the biggest challenges CD faced as a young poet was, of course, coming out from under that wing. And by her own admission, said after Frank's death, my poems are sounding very much like Frank Stanford, and I'm trying very hard to get out from that. And she does, of course, eventually she does. But for all the, for as terribly as Frank treated many of the women that he was with, when it came to their art, he put their interests first. And I really mean that. They're in some very concrete ways. He put their growth and development as artists ahead of his own. And so, the first book that he publishes with Lost Roads, or that CD and Frank published by Frank's insistence, is CD's first book, Land Surveyor's Daughter. Is that right? Am I getting that right? I'm mixing it up with that one.
There's A La Breve Long.
So A La Breve Loving was actually published by Mill Mountain.
Right.
Yeah, but Frank made that happen. Right? That was the thesis. Frank made that happen. Now you have a publication, and in any case, he was extremely supportive of them, both creatively, artistically, and professionally as well.
Anything that you want to say maybe about, I don't know how much time we have, but I'd love you to say something, of course, about the saint of New Orleans. You dedicate the book to Ralph Adamo. It's someone who I had the pleasure to meet in 2017 when I went around the country with Mom, and of course it was wonderful to meet Ralph, poet, friend, Frank's friend, and just what you learn with him and through him. And
Okay, so I mean, Ralph in some ways is the epitome of my entire experience writing this book, which was interviewing Frank's friends and acquaintances and colleagues and family, and then branching out and interviewing people who maybe didn't know Frank directly but knew of him. Bottom line is, like, I don't know, this sounds so corny, but people are really generous and wonderful. Like, I kind of reached the conclusion that when it comes to actually what matters, which is promoting the great work of a poet who hasn't had his due, people gave me so much. And Ralph was at the top of that list. The first interview I did for this book, the first formal interview I did for this book, and I should say, I didn't know how to do interviews. Like, I went into this blind and cold. And I went to New Orleans, and I met Ralph, and I scheduled about an hour. And we talked for 4.5 hours. And we were just getting started. And he sort of made it clear to me that he would always be there for me in any way. So he was a constant throughout this book. I went back to Ralph hundreds of times. And he was incredibly generous, but he's also one of the very few people who would ask me, like, are you losing your mind and how are you feeling about it? You know, like, he would kind of check in with me emotionally as well. So he just got that. He's incredibly humble, and he's an amazing poet who I also think has been underserved in many ways as well.
who was part of the program, correct? He was.
Oh yeah, he knew
right.
Frank very well. They were in the program together, and they stayed in touch until Frank's death.
And it's where Frank spends his last night before he goes back to Fayetteville.
Yeah.
Is there anything perhaps that you, well, two things. First, I would like you to say something about, the archives in the plural, because we know what Frank published during his lifetime, and of course this book that came out and what's come out posthumously. But what is in the Beinecke, but also beyond the Beinecke? Because the Beinecke is not 100% of the archive.
No, not by any stretch. I want to say that the Beinecke was a absolutely great place to work. They were so supportive during COVID about getting me scans of documents, and like, I can't compliment that library enough in terms of how they supported me. But they don't have anything near close to a collection of like a full collection of Frank's archives. Stanford's, and I should say, when I started this book, I thought it was. I mean, so that's why, I had to go and kind of build the archive. Drawing on the Beinecke, I organized Irv Broughton's archive. He had mostly letters between Irv and Frank, but other things as well, including drafts of early poems, including like markups of early versions of The Singing Knives or Field Talk or some of the other poems, some of Frank's art. Irv did interviews with Frank as well. I mean, a ton of stuff. As much, if not more, than the Beinecke. Then Frank's niece, his sister's daughter, also had boxes and boxes of completely unprocessed Stanford stuff. I went through it. I built the archive. There's an archive of photographs, and there's an archive of newspaper clippings. There's an archive that includes his baby book. I mean, it was just his fishing records from when he was 10 to 12 years old. And so, that took an enormous amount of time. I mean, organizing it and then processing it. What worries me is that for future Stanford studies, like, this stuff is really scattered. There are also just letters out there that we haven't been able to get a hold of. I went through Tom Lux's wife's, Tom Lux died in 2017, I think. I went through his wife's attic, through every piece of paper Tom Lux owned, looking for those letters from Frank. Not there. A woman, the wife of an editor who has since died in Maine, has a folder of Frank's letters that she can't find. and go to her house and go through everything.
But there is a
inside it.
forthcoming volume of letters. Correct?
There is,
So
yeah.
that-
So there is a selected letters, not by me. A.P. Walton
Right,
is
right,
putting that
right.
out. But there's still more out there. So, I mean, the bottom line is, like, Stanford lived his life having no clue that he would ever be Frank Stanford, if you know what I mean. Like, he didn't know that there would be this kind of interest in his work. And so when he wrote his letters, he was writing honest letters. He wasn't writing letters that he thought people would read someday. And as a result, people who got his letters weren't like, oh, I got to preserve this Frank Stanford letter, you know. And so that makes it complicated as a researcher. And there's definitely still more to discover, but I think I got to everything that I could, anyway, without totally losing my mind.
Is there anything before we turn it to the audience that you want to say, or anyone that you want to thank, or anything that comes to mind, or anything?
Oh, man.
I mean, not thank, because we have a list, long list.
Yeah,
But
no, I mean, I guess, like, this is my last of all the book events that I've done. This is my last one for this season, I guess. I've got a few things in the spring, but you know, I mean, I can't, like, there's no way I can really express my thanks, honestly, like, without sounding like I'm just so grateful for the way that people helped me do this book, so many people. But I will say, like, I've discovered doing this that there's just a kind of rare pleasure in getting together with other people who read Stanford, or maybe just want to read Stanford, and discussing those poems, discussing that life. It's something I really never expected to kind of discover this late in life. I mean, I hope it's not that late in life, but, you know, at the age that I'm at. And it's reassuring that you can kind of make these discoveries as you move into middle age and beyond. So it's been a truly, like, personally, like, life-affirming project that basically comes down to reading and discussing Stanford's poems with other people.
grazie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. Let's turn it to the room. Or any questions? Anything you want to ask James? Please.
Oh, I found a ton of stuff.
Did you
about
find
John
anything about
Stoss.
John
Did
Stoss?
I find anything about John Stoss? Yes. I mean, we can discuss afterwards, but I found, let's just say I own now 25 John Stoss paintings. And I discovered John Stoss in Salinas, California, and did an in-person interview with him, I think a year before he died. I found some critiques of Frank Stanford about John Stoss's poems that were turned into a Lost Roads book. I found a million stories of John Stoss trying to find a place to sleep at night and finding a friend who would let him in. He lived in New Orleans out of his car for a while. There's a book to be written on John Stoss, and he actually just had a big book of poems come out called Nobody Loves Me. It came out, I think, 3 years.
Do you think he had an influence
Frank
on Frank?
Initially, when he first read John Stoss, Frank said, "This is a real poet." Frank deeply appreciated Stoss's poetry. I don't know that Frank would ever claim to have been influenced by John Stoss, but I will say that Frank very much admired John Stoss's work. John Stoss as a person started to get on Frank's nerves a little bit as they worked together, but no, in terms of his poetry, Frank was a fan.
Please. So just to paraphrase that for those live streaming, so how the archive has influenced you, I guess, and helped you to maybe get away from the myth and be able to work through Frank Stanford, the creator, the worker, and not fall into the gap of myth and Frank. And
Is that what you're after? Yeah. Okay.
Partly.
Yeah. No, I can speak to that for sure. And so when you say archive, though, you mean not just the Beinecke. You mean like just the corpus of Frank's work, correct? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. So when Frank decided to go the Irv Broughton route, as I was talking about earlier, this meant doing things like finding a printer. And Frank ended up finding a printer who lived in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. He found him on a surveying trip, a semi-literate turkey hunter who happened to have a press. Now, a lot of poets might think this is not a ideal situation. Frank's like, we'll do the typesetting. I think Frank did some surveying work for him in exchange. So what we're talking about here is when that book appears, okay, when that book enters the archive, the story behind it isn't turning it over to an impersonal press who prints it and publishes it and distributes it. We're talking about Frank Stanford surveying, meeting a turkey hunter who has a press, and swapping surveying work for this guy to get the book published. So when that thing surfaces, and only 250 of them surface, people interact with that archival product not just on the basis of the poetry in it, but on that mythical story behind it. And I also think I should build on that and say that we often say that Frank Stanford built a myth. He mythologized himself or created his own myth. I mean, yes, to a point, but I think at the same time, he kind of just lifted the veil on himself. I think he was a mythical character, and I think some people are just mythical. I mean, I could give you a list of things that Frank was genuinely experienced, and you'd say, well, that just sounds like a mythical character, but that was Frank. And so I think in some ways, when we say that Frank was creating his myth, I think he was just showing us that myth. Because there was nothing affected about going to Sherman's. There was nothing affected about the story I just told you about getting that printing press. And, so that's a microcosmic kind of answer to, I think, something that can be generalized with Stanford.
One more question, yes.
The guy in the back. This better be a nice question. This is my son.
Please.
Yeah. So I mean,
you want to say the question?
The question is
the chameleon. So the chameleon Frank. So how by interacting with so many different people who knew Frank, that like how did that help you navigate Frank, the chameleon, who had been yet so many throughout his lifetime?
Absolutely. So I mean, two ways I'd answer your question, Owen. One is the stories that I heard about Frank before going into the research were like, this guy told a lot of lies, like he was deceptive. And there's no question that there's that one great deception at the end of his life where he was telling different stories to his wife and his lover. No question about that deception. But I went into this work thinking that deception would pervade his life, and it didn't. He actually lived a fairly honest and straight shooting life. So there's a bit of a relief there as I got into Now, the way I figured that out is, he would write letters about something to 10 different people. Now, I would expect him to tell that story differently for every individual, but he doesn't. He tells it straight every time. So there's a way where his honesty kind of checks itself. But the other question really comes down to memory. And so Frank Stanford would remember things in writing, and I would read that, and then I would interview other people who would remember it differently. And now you've got an issue on your hands, because you've got 5 or 6 versions of the same story. And one of these stories was Frank at a party shooting a Parker rifle through the roof to clear people out of the house. It's a big part of the legend. And I ended up getting 6 versions of the story. Probably because everybody there was drunk, high, on drugs, and had their own version of that story. So what do? Well, you sort of acknowledge the fact that as biographers, as historians, we're not finding and rebuilding and reconstituting a scene down to its objective truth. Historians are writing fiction with more rules, and that's kind of what I would resort to and say, well, I have 6 stories here. I've done my due diligence in terms of figuring out what happened. I'm going to write a composite and use my judgment and tell people that I think history is fiction with some rules. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Everyone, thank you so much. James, again, thank you so much. There are books for sale here. And for those who haven't read Frank yet, Frank Stanford, and more to come, both the letters and the bottle.